Hello, GBC family. It's the producer Claire speaking. Unfortunately, Ponta is unwell today, so I will be taking over. But I'm really excited because it's going to be a great conversation. It's finally June, the sun is out, and it's Pride Month. So what does that mean? Well, every year, many countries around the world celebrate 2SLGBTQ people and communities with big festivals and events, which in Ontario happens throughout the month of June, with the official Pride Parade down Church Street in Toronto happening Sunday, June 25th. And why do we do this? Well, in many parts of the world, including here in Canada, 2SLGBTQ people are not always accepted by others, and this can lead to judgment at best and extreme violence at worst. That's why it's really important to take a moment to show some love to the community while sharing some information and raising awareness each year. So how are we talking about Pride at George Brown this year? Well, today I have with me Wren Alden from the Office of Anti-Racism, Equity and Human Rights Services. Welcome, Wren, and thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm doing well, enjoying the sunshine. How are you?
Yeah, good. So what is your connection to the Pride Month 2SLGBTQ queer community?
Well, quite simply, I'm a queer and trans person. I'm part of the 2SLGBTQ plus community. And I've done a lot of work, both professionally and personally, in building more queer-friendly mental health supports, gender-affirming care and post-secondary education, from like best practice in clinics to insurance coverage, everything in between. And overall, developing a lot of education to support people who are interested in equity and anti-oppressive work. And I'm your new awareness and education program coordinator at the Office of Anti-Racism, Equity and Human Rights Services. So I'm mostly on the proactive side of the house. So we try to prevent discrimination, harassment, and oppression before it happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how do you do that?
Yeah, well, lots of what I do is developing training, education sessions, along with awareness campaigns like this and celebratory events like what we have going on through Pride. And I also collaborate with a lot of folks across the college to support their work with research, consultations, all sorts of supports. And got lots in my portfolio.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about like why Pride is important and what it means. When was the first time that you heard about Pride as an event in the queer community?
Yeah, well, I'm from Toronto, so I don't really remember ever not knowing that Pride existed.
Okay.
But as I got older and had more questions that, let's just say, my family wasn't great at answering, I got to like look into it and learn a lot more about the community and origins of Pride and why it's important still today.
Okay.
And I usually go to the Trans March on the days prior to Pride proper on Sunday. And those experiences are just wonderful to just be around community and around people who are trans and queer and who really, really care about making the world a better place for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Has the Trans March always been part of the Pride Parade in Toronto?
No, it has not. It has for a very long time been at the same time, like around the same time as official Toronto Pride, but it's only recently that it has become part of Toronto Pride proper.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm glad that it's an official part of the Toronto Pride. And so do you know the story of Stonewall and how Pride started? And how did learning this affect your experience at Pride events or your experience as a queer person? And maybe I should mention what Stonewall is. My understanding is that Stonewall was a riot that happened at the Stonewall Inn in New York in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, so the Stonewall Inn was well known to be a place where queer and trans folks gathered to just celebrate, enjoy themselves. And at the time, there's still a number of laws that banned, especially people who are wearing, I believe the term was like female or male impersonation, but people wearing a certain number of articles of clothing of the wrong gender. And of course, the police would come in, go around, check people's IDs, and arrest folks for breaking that law. And what happened at Stonewall that particular night was that at a certain point, folks said, actually, we don't need to be putting up with this. This is ridiculous. We need to stop accepting that like every few weeks or more frequently than that even, the police are just going to come in, book a bunch of us, arrest us, and then maybe eventually let us go. But I think one of the main impacts that learning the story of Stonewall is, and also knowing people who were like present at the bathhouse raids in Toronto, is understanding how like laws are important to protect us, but they are not all that protects us. We protect ourselves and we need to form safety within our communities. So I think knowing the story of Stonewall and knowing what kinds of action it took to bring queer and trans issues to the forefront in even slightly more positive ways has been impactful on how I think about our duties to those who have come before us and our responsibilities for the next generation.
Yeah. It's like community taking action.
Yeah, exactly. And people saying Pride was a riot was not simply Pride was a riot that occurred out of nowhere, but was in response to violence enacted on queer and trans folks simply for existing.
Yeah. And unfortunately, some of that violence, those types of things still happen today. So like we need Pride still every year.
Yeah.
Well, that brings me to the next question, I guess. How relevant do you think the political history of Pride feels to today's queer communities?
Yeah. I think especially within the last few years, the political history of Pride amid the context of increasing truly violent to genocidal laws, policies, and rhetoric, and the uptick of violence against queer and trans community, especially also at the intersections of racism, classism, and transphobia, are a reminder that community organizing and community action is necessary for us to be able to have celebrations like Pride. It is necessary that we come together and don't let ourselves be divided in order to both take political action and be able to celebrate. So I think Pride is an important celebration and also an important reminder of the resistance that it took to get us here.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a lot more talk about gender identity in the media these days. So in your own words, what does gender identity mean compared to sexual identity, for instance?
Yeah. So I think if you'd like to learn more, you're welcome to join the 2SLGBTQ plus Fundamentals to Action training we've got later this June. But very briefly, gender identity, the way I'd define it, is just our own sense of our own gender. So gender as a larger concept can often include things like our gender expression and presentation, how we're showing ourselves to the world, our style, our clothes, our mannerisms, our relational and social aspects of our gender, like our names, pronouns, social relationships, like, oh, I'm this person's girlfriend. Oh, I'm this person's father. But gender identity itself is something that everyone's got, which is how do you identify yourself in gender? What groups do you see yourself as a part of or distinct from?
Yeah, that's what groups do you feel you're a part of?
Because of course, a cis woman and a trans woman will have different experiences of womanhood, but so will a straight woman and a lesbian. So will women from different cultures, different class backgrounds, women who work in different fields and different jobs. Like I've got friends who are cis women who work in fashion and cis women who work in welding, and they have very different understandings of what it means to be a woman and very different personal senses of their own gender that aren't the exact same, of course, but they're both women. So I think it's important when we're thinking about gender identity to not limit our categories to trying to find some essential characteristic that makes someone necessarily one gender or another beyond that, but instead to understand gender categories are ways that we come together around experiences that we often share. But that doesn't mean that those experiences are necessarily the same for anyone, nor does it mean that those experiences are exclusive to people in those categories. That makes sense?
I think so, yeah. And it has me remembering my own experiences as well. Like I identify as a woman, but I feel uncomfortable in certain female spaces that are more hyper feminized, I guess. And when people call me a lady, lady just feels like a different gender or something.
Yeah,
to me.
Of course. And even among cis people, we're not the same gender we are from birth. If we say it's a girl, it's a boy, we are not always baby girl, baby boy as we grow up. Because as we grow and change, as we get interested in different things, as we meet new people, our sense and our ways of knowing ourselves in our gender and other parts of our identities do grow and change and shift with us. So I think it's important for not just trans folks, but cis people to understand their gender as something that is constantly developing and not something that is essential to a certain body part or anything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Although trans and non-binary people have existed forever, gender identity was only recently added to the list of protected groups in the Canadian Human Rights Act with the passing of Bill C-16 in June 2017. So why is this important?
Yeah. So I'd also add that gender identity and gender expression were added to the Ontario Human Rights Code in, I believe, 2012, and then particular guidance in 2014. But the importance of this, as I said, laws and policies can deter violence, transphobia, and the like, although they can't necessarily prevent all of it. But it is important both on a symbolic sense to say, yes, we know that this is a group that is being unfairly discriminated against, harassed, persecuted, and oppressed. And we say, this is something that we need to take seriously and have ways to remediate. So being able to say, if someone's experiencing homophobia or transphobia in the classroom at George Brown, we hope that doesn't happen. And that we hope that by having anti-discrimination policies, that will deter that kind of behavior, alongside, of course, having education and things of the like. But if that does happen, it's important to have these policies and these laws in place so that people who do experience it can access supports, access accommodations, and access resolution for discrimination that they're experiencing. So although those protections do not necessarily solve everything, they do make both symbolic and material differences in the lives of people who would be facing transphobia and other forms of discrimination and harassment based on their perceived or actual gender identity and gender expression.
Okay. Yeah, and you mentioned before that you do preventative work in the Board's department. And is there someone in that department who would be able to respond if a case of harassment took place?
Absolutely. So we have both our sexual and gender-based violence advisors and our human rights advisors who are here to support if anything like that ever happens. If you witness something, if you experience something, always just shoot an email out to diversity@georgebrown.ca or svra@georgebrown.ca. The ORS office is here to support anyone, students, staff, faculty, who experiences or witnesses discrimination, harassment based on any protected grounds. And we're here to provide support and to resolve those issues so that the kind of things that happens and causes harm to people is less likely to happen again.
Are there any other issues or topics in the 2SLGBTQ community these days that you think are important to highlight?
Yeah. The other thing that I'd like to highlight is that issues of gender liberation and bodily autonomy and reproductive justice are all intertwined. If we try to say, oh, well, we want people to have access to this kind of reproductive care if they're women, then we will see the definition of women narrowing and narrowing to exclude more and more people from that care. If we want to say, oh, most people deserve bodily autonomy unless they're not mentally capable, we'll see definitions of disability expand to exclude more and more people from that necessary and life-saving care. So I think it's important to keep in mind that homophobia and transphobia are not simply issues about and for queer and trans people, and not just people who might be mistaken as one of us. But these are important principles and practices to keep in mind in larger issues of feminism, of racial justice, and of all our anti-oppressive work that we do, both at George Brown College and out in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then I think one other thing that I'd like to share is just that queer and trans representation, seeing more people out in the world being queer and trans and happy, isn't something that turns people queer or trans. All it does is gives people opportunities to explore possibilities of gender and orientation that they might not have known exists. And regardless of if someone turns out to actually be 2SLGBTQ plus or not, exploration is only a good thing, provided that we are not creating homophobic, transphobic, and otherwise hostile communities around them. So the more inclusive and welcoming we can make our communities of difference and diversity in gender and orientation, the better that is for everyone, both queer and trans folks and people who are outside the community just want to do something a little fun with their genders or try out where they might be attracted to people.
Yeah. Or like, hey, maybe you just have a new queer trans friend who is awesome and you just improved your life.
Yeah, exactly.
So that brings me to allyship. So Pride is not just for queer people to participate in, it's open to everyone and it's a lot of fun. So whether you're gay or straight. So can you talk about what allyship is and what it might look like?
Yeah, so I always have a little bit of a funny relationship with the term ally, because allyship is not really a badge of honor you can confer upon yourself. You can't say, oh, I'm an ally now. But allyship is something that you do. It's a set of actions that sometimes can be a bit uncomfortable and sometimes can involve making mistakes and getting things wrong. But allyship is, at its best at least, showing up with and for queer and trans folks, even and often, especially when you don't see that we're in a space, so that we don't have to be, oh, that's the first person I've ever met who uses those pronouns. But so that we don't have to go into a space and experience harm to bring it to your attention so that it gets solved. So allyship, I think, is one person who I'm more than willing to call a good ally is my good friend Christopher, who is the most cisgender heterosexual guy I know, but also is a very good ally for like three main things. One, he does the work of being inclusive. He puts in the work to get people's like names, pronouns, partners right. He doesn't go out of his way to like complain that it's hard, it's difficult. He just does it. He like goes on the little things and like practices using someone's pronouns and he gets it right and he does it. And then thing two that he does is he just makes homophobia and transphobia unacceptable in like straight environments. Just the power of simply saying like, oh, that's not cool, bro. Or like, why do you think that's funny? It's so easy to simply deploy that and be silent and wait for someone to stutter through their explanation, but make it uncool and unacceptable to be homophobic and transphobic in his presence, whether or not queer and trans people are there. And then he also he keeps up to date on what's going on. He notices the news and reaches out to support when bad things are happening. And he does the work of like helping organize and write letters, whatever, when it's needed. He doesn't just say like, let me know what I can do and do nothing. He actually offers options and follows through on them without having to be asked. So I think allyship is like, of course, Christopher gets things wrong all the time, but he's open to corrections. He's open to learning more, and he's invested in doing the work, even when it doesn't directly benefit him. And that's what I think is good allyship, if allyship is a term we want to use.
Sure. Yeah. And it reminds me of, because I play music in another world of my life, but I was hearing someone talk about what talent is, and it's not you're just naturally born with it or you're not. It's like the ability to fail over and over again and keep going. Like being good at failing, I think was the definition. And it kind of reminds me of that. Like you're saying, Christopher gets things wrong too, but like he's pretty darn good at that because he keeps finding ways to try getting things right.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to try something and get something wrong. And he takes like corrections, updates, and all of that as what they are, which is an act of grace and hope and trust. That's, we know that you care and we know that you want to do better. And we know that you're not going to take this and like retreat into fragility or being like, oh, this is why no one tries to help you. You've got all these terms, but genuinely is trying to help and takes those corrections and feedback as something that's there to help him be a better ally, to help him support better. So I think knowing and being able to and demonstrating that if someone trusts you enough to push back a bit on your work, if you're willing to respond with openness and warmth and thanking them rather than with fragility and retreating from the work and being afraid of making those mistakes, that's something that makes you far more suited to doing the work of allyship. But it's not something that you're born with. No one's born, including queer and trans folks, knowing every term, every way of discussing things, all of the politics. So again, allyship is something that involves putting in work and continuing to do that work, even when it's not immediately rewarding.
Yeah. So if someone wants to be an ally and wants to check out some of the Pride events, what are some good things for them to keep in mind while they're participating?
Of course. Well, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that Pride spaces are one of truly vanishingly few spaces where we don't have to presume cis heteronormativity. We don't have to assume everyone's straight or cisgender unless proven otherwise, unless they come out. So if you're straight and cis and want to come to Pride, by all means, you're invited, you're welcome. But keep in mind that these events center, celebrate, and are for people who are expressing unabashed queerness and transness. So I guess the few tips I'd give you is just don't make it about you. You're not here to be the center of attention. Pass the mic whenever the opportunity is available to you, and celebrate our community's resilience and joy, even in the face of violence, and find ways that we can go beyond simply having a fun rainbow party and trying to make meaningful differences in the lives of queer and trans people, even once all the rainbows get put away and Pride Month is over.
Yeah. And it's such a privilege really to go into the space of someone else, like go into someone else's home, sort of in a way, and be witness to their lives and just be able to learn from them too, without demanding a lesson.
Absolutely.
But
and no one's like checking your queer or trans card at the door. But if you're coming into these spaces with the openness and with the willingness to not assume people are majority straight or cis, and not assume you know someone's gender, who they're attracted to just by looking at them, then you're far better positioned to be able to enjoy yourself, but not make as many missteps, we'll say, at the festivities.
What is your department at George Brown doing to celebrate Pride this year, and how can we get involved?
Of course. Yeah. So we've got lots of events. On June 1st, we had the flag raising event and the panel about being seen, the importance of 2SLGBTQ plus visibility. June 6th and 8th, we'll have a little craft and tea social where folks can get together in a nice, chill social space, make some pins, make some bracelets, do some coloring, just have a nice time to hang out. We'll have Pride photo areas at Convocation. June 20th, we have a cookie decorating. So give you cookies, give you colorful icing, and you can make a cookie that celebrates you. And in the last week of June, we'll have workshops on 2SLGBTQ plus fundamentals to action. So to support and build your capacity to support queer and trans folks wherever you are. And of course, this isn't ORS sponsored, but Toronto Pride is, well, especially the weekend of the 23rd to 25th. So if you want to go out there, you're always welcome.
Awesome. Thank you. And where can we find you or your services online for future inquiries?
Of course. So if you check out georgebrown.ca/pride, that'll give you a nice overview of all of the events we're running. If you want to check out our office, go to georgebrown.ca/diversity and follow us on Instagram at ORS_GBC. That's OAREHRS_GBC. So Office of Anti-Racism, Equity, and Human Rights Services _GBC.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Alrighty, thank you.
Thank you so much, for taking the time to talk about this today.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important for people to know more about this topic, and I'm so glad you're doing the work that you do.
Thank you.
So for students, make sure to check out Pride events on campus and off campus this year. There's lots of fun things to do. Thanks again, Wren, and take care and happy Pride.
Happy Pride.